Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of Newfoundland and Labrador's 2017 Vital Signs Report. My name is Ainsley Hawthorn. I'm Executive Director of the Community Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. And on behalf of both the Community Foundation and the Leslie Harris Center for Regional Policy and Development, I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. This is our fourth annual Vital Signs Report for the province, and we've been really delighted to be able to bring this information about quality of life in our communities to the province for the fourth year now. Just to give you a sense of what's happening this morning, in addition to the people who are here in the room with us in St. John's, we have a live cast that is up online and people are tuning into that. We also have satellite launches that are taking place in both Happy Valley Goose Bay and Corner Brook. So welcome to everyone that's in those locations with us right now. What will be happening over the course of the morning is that I'll be presenting some information on the National Vital Signs Report, which is produced by Community Foundation of Canada. It gives some useful context for when we're going into looking at the provincial level statistics. Then Dr. Rob Greenwood of the Harris Center is going to be presenting the findings from our province's Vital Signs Report that we've produced. Afterwards, we'll be joined by a panel of community experts who'll be able to take questions, both from people here in the room, from our satellite launch locations, and also from people who are tuning in online. So as you're listening to information, please feel free to write down anything that strikes you or that you're interested in learning more about, and hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some more details on that. And then following our official launch, we're going to be having our first Vital conversation, which is happening here in St. John's, as well as in Corner Brook and Happy Valley Goose Bay. So for those of you who are staying for that, thank you very much. We look forward to talking to you about how we can put the data in the report into action in our communities, and also about things that you want to see Vital Signs cover in future years. So this morning, I'm going to be talking a bit about our National Vital Signs Report, which is produced for the country as a whole. So the Vital Signs program is run nationally by Community Foundation of Canada, and it has a national component and local components. So throughout the month of October, community foundations across the country are releasing reports on their local areas, like Toronto's Vital Signs, Victoria's Vital Signs, and so forth. So we're one of those local level reports. The national level reports for the past 3 years have been covering the subject of belonging in the lead up to 2017. This year is the 150th anniversary of Canada's Confederation. And so the idea to focus on belonging was to think about how communities include people, and also how we as individuals reach out and connect to people around us. So last year's national report looked at how Canadians participate in their communities through arts and culture, activism, faith, sports and recreation, and volunteerism. Now, this year's report asks what systems and institutions we have in place to integrate people into our communities, and how successful those institutions are at supporting inclusion. So what is the value of belonging? It's not just a feel-good concept, but fostering inclusion and trust is actually fundamental to building engaged communities where everyone feels they have a stake in the future. And research has shown that a strong sense of belonging contributes not only to health and safety, but also when community members trust each other, people give more of their time and money to support their community, social inclusion improves, and we're more resilient in the face of community emergencies. So the national report this year covers 6 themes. The top 3 things that Canadians say make a community a good place to live are affordability, public safety, and employment opportunities. So while many threads are needed to weave together a community's pattern of belonging, inclusion, this year's Vital Signs research focuses on exploring 6 key thematic threads. So the first is where we live, second, public spaces, then economic inclusion, migration and citizenship, safety and security, and families. So the first subject area, where we live, it really gets to the root of the places that we wake up every single day, our neighborhoods and our very local communities, right down to the households that we're living in. So 63% of Canadians are happy with their homes. The average household size in Canada today is 2.4 people. This is very similar to the Canadian or to the Newfoundland average, which is 2.3 people per household. And this is really a change from the way the Canadian households have looked historically. So more people are living alone than ever before. It's almost a third of Canadians now compared to only 6% 75 years ago. And fewer people than ever live in large households with more than 5 people. We've also seen a demographic change over the past decade or so, where children are growing up, the children of baby boomers, and moving out of their parents' houses. So houses that used to be 3 to 4 people are now declining to 2 people as people are moving out of their parents' homes. When we look at the types of houses that people are living in, about half of Canadians live in single detached homes. This is actually very different from the picture we get in Newfoundland and Labrador that Rob is going to be telling you more about in a bit. More Newfoundlanders than Canadians in general live in single detached homes, and very few people in this province live, for instance, in high-rise apartment buildings compared to the rest of Canada. Since 2004, 2005, housing prices have skyrocketed across the country. So this graph considers a number of different cities where housing prices have shot up, but we've seen the same thing here in this province, both in the St. John's metropolitan area and in communities right across the province. We looked at that in last year's Newfoundland and Labrador vital signs report. In Victoria, British Columbia, the average house costs 8.1 times the median household income, compared to 2.6 times in Charlottetown, PEI. In Newfoundland, the average house costs 3.8 times annual household income. In St. John's, it's actually about the same, about 3.9 times. So if you're thinking of the comparison between what people are making to what type of home they're actually able to afford with that money, there's a substantial discrepancy that's increased in recent years. Housing also is a place where we can see discrimination and marginalization at work. So for instance, 21.7% of Indigenous people live in homes that need major repairs versus 6.8% of non-Indigenous people. So this will come up a few times as I'm speaking, that we can actually see the way people are being marginalized in some of these different theme areas. Shared spaces in places like libraries, parks, and cultural events are vital threads in our social fabric because they literally bring people in communities together into a shared space. Changing a community's physical environment can make a big impact on how people move around and how they interact with each other. So in the national report this year, there was a high focus on libraries, which is something that's relevant to this province because we've been having a lot of discussion about the relevance of libraries over the past year and a half or so. There are 3,598 public libraries in Canada and 360 million visits made annually to libraries. Public and school libraries, however, across the country have experienced unprecedented budget cuts and closures. That's not an issue that's only affecting our province, but is something that's happening nationwide, despite the fact that 41% of Canadians are actually active public library card holders and users. And library use, and this may be counterintuitive, is actually on the rise. So I think many of us would think, oh, in the digital age, many people are accessing things online at home and they're less likely to go out to their local libraries. That's actually not the case. So in 2009, there were about 24 library transactions per Canadian versus only about 17 in 2000. And 21.8 million questions are asked by people in public libraries each year. So public libraries are still a vital hub where people are getting information about their communities. And when you think about the internet, public libraries are also a place where people who don't have internet access at home can access online resources, online communities. So they remain a very vital hub for community engagement across the country. When asked what makes a community a good place to live, Canadians said first, affordability, and third, employment opportunities. When asked what types of communities people identify with other than geographic ones, our most common response is workplaces and people who share the same line of work, because these are people we spend much of our days with. But our workplaces nationwide are changing. So about 48% of millennials and 29% of baby boomers work from home some or all of the time, and 15.2% of working Canadians are self-employed. So fewer people than ever before are actually going into workplaces where they're interacting with colleagues. More and more people are working in solitary environments. Income and employment is another area that's impacted by discrimination in a big way. So if we look, for instance, at median incomes, the median income of racialized people, and this would be people with some sort of visible difference, it's hard to find a way to express it, but non-white individuals or people who are non-white passing have 80 or have only 80% of the Canadian median income. And the median income of Indigenous people is even lower at only 72% of the Canadian median income. Moreover, most people dramatically underestimate the inequality of wealth distribution in Canada. So when you ask people how much wealth does the richest 20% own, they think 55.5%, which is already really high for the top 20%. The reality is 67.4% is held by the top 20% in Canada. When you ask people how much wealth does the poorest 20% own, Canadians think 5.8%, it's actually 0%. So when we're talking about people in the bottom 20%, those are people who can't accumulate wealth. So those are people who aren't able to own homes, who have more debt than they have assets and so forth. When we look at 6%, which is what Canadians think the bottom 20% own, that's actually closer to what the bottom half of all Canadians own, is 6% of all the wealth in the country. On the topic of migration and citizenship, 20.6% of Canadians were born outside Canada and arrived as immigrants. Now, as we know, this is different from the situation that we have here in Newfoundland and Labrador, where we have a smaller proportion of immigrants than other parts of Canada. And we'll be discussing today a little bit about how many people in Newfoundland and Labrador were, for instance, born in Newfoundland and Labrador as opposed to elsewhere. Most immigrants, however, have a very strong sense of belonging, and substantially higher than people who are born in Canada. So about 93% of immigrants have a strong sense of belonging to Canada compared to 88% of people born in Canada. And immigrants tend to place more importance on knowing their neighbors on a first name basis and being able to trust people as factors they consider important for high quality of life. Immigrants with a strong sense of belonging to both Canada and their home country is about 69%, and immigrants with a strong sense of belonging to Canada and a lower sense of belonging to their home country is about 24%. Immigrants tend to display a strong sense of belonging to their city of residence as well as to their ethnic group. But experiencing discrimination and racism discourages newcomers' sense of belonging in the receiving country. The benchmarks of the welcoming community are positive attitudes toward cultural diversity, the presence of diverse religious and cultural institutions, and also social engagement opportunities for community members. So as you'll see in Newfoundland and Labrador's Vital Signs report, most Newfoundland and Labradorians feel that they do live in welcoming communities. And some of this information can give us ways that we can actually think about improving the ways that our communities are welcoming and reach out to newcomers. In safety and security, which is also something that we'll be covering in our provincial vital signs report, when asked what makes a community a good place to live, public safety is the second most common response. And the good news is that crime is on the decline in Canada as a whole. So since 2004, there's been a 42% decrease in household victimization, 20% decrease in violent victimization, and 20% decrease in theft of personal property. There's been a 0% decrease in sexual assault, but this is a very difficult category of crime to measure because of reporting problems. For reasons of discrimination and disbelief, many people don't necessarily come forward to report sexual assault. So if you look at the statistics from year to year, they actually vary widely. And that is probably mostly due to reporting problems. Even though in many ways Canada is getting safer, public perception isn't keeping pace. So 88% of Canadians believe that crime rates in their communities are increasing or staying the same. That said, most Canadians, around 93%, are satisfied with their personal safety from crime. But sense of safety varies widely according to demographic. So white Canadians are the most likely to believe police treat people fairly and to feel comfortable approaching police, while racialized Canadians are less so, and Indigenous Canadians are least likely. And we have an article in our Vital Signs report this year that actually talks about an initiative of the Halapu Cultural Foundation and the RNC on the west coast of the province to address some of these distrust issues between Indigenous communities and the police. And women feel less safe than men walking alone in their neighborhoods after dark and using public transportation after dark. And any of you who were on social media over the past week probably saw the Me Too campaign, where I imagine many people in this room, and for men, many women of your acquaintance were coming forward to say that they have in their experience been sexually harassed and assaulted. And the ways that women feel unsafe in their environments limits their ability to participate in their communities. If you're not able, or if you don't feel safe walking after dark or taking public transportation, you're just going to go out less, you're going to engage less. So this is really a problem with how we're able to include people and bring people into communities. And finally, families. Um, Income is a big factor in how able families are to provide for themselves, to provide for their children. 87% of low-income kids say that families like theirs will struggle to pay for their post-secondary education. 50% of parents say that their family's lack of money is hurting their children, and 88% of Canadians believe that families are under a lot of financial pressure. So obviously there's a strong perception that the ease of raising a family in this country has changed. People providing regular care to a child or a spouse who has high health needs, which is something that we see more and more of, about a third of those caregivers feel depressed, and about a quarter experience financial difficulties arising from the health needs of the person they're caring for. 64% of millennials and 39% of people aged 55 and over believe that family is whoever you choose to surround yourself with. So more people are creating their own families and defining families in a new way other than just biological families. But in the last 20 years, the proportion of 11 to 15-year-olds that feel understood by their parents has actually increased. So despite the myth of teenagers and parents never getting along, that is actually something that is currently shifting in the Canadian landscape, which is sort of an interesting piece of data. So in conclusion, our population has risen substantially since Canada's 100th anniversary in 1967 by about 15 million people nationwide. And based on people's survey responses, 38% of Canadians don't feel like they have a strong stake in their local community. Only half of Canadians think that being involved in community events or activities is important. So as we move into the consideration of our provincial vital signs report today and the community conversation that we're going to be having afterwards, one of the key things that we'd like people to think about is steps that we can take to change the institutions in our communities in order to make them places where everyone has a higher standard of living, higher quality of life, and also feels socially integrated so that we can avoid social exclusion. So thank you all again for turning out here today and for tuning in online if you're joining us that way. So now I will be passing the mic over to Rob Greenwood, who is going to be telling us about our provincial vital signs report. Thank you very much, Rob.